Good morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. My name is Ralf Friedrichs. I am an author, an addiction recovery coach, a life coach, and the host of this show, the Take Your Life Back Today radio show. You can also see a video version on this on YouTube on channel Take Your Life Back Today show. As you can see, it's still dark, but I want you not to ever put yourself in others' shoes. As humans, we have this habit of putting ourselves in the shoes of another living being and image how their experience would be like. For an example, my friends, you might see a handicapped beggar on the roadside looking for food in a garbage can and immediately get a sick feeling to your stomach because in that moment you are trying to put yourself in the shoes of the beggar and imagine what it must be like for him to live that way. We also use the term for it called empathy. But in truth, my friends, whenever you put yourself in the shoes of another person, you will always get a very skewed idea of what's really going on because the level of consciousness you are at his, not the level of consciousness the other person is at, and the experiences are always personal. Friends, those personal experiences determined by the level of consciousness in a living being in that moment. It's like you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of an animal and imagine what it must be feeling. One reason why so many animal activists feel so much suffering within themselves, because they constantly keep projecting themselves into the shoes of the animals, imagining what the animals must be going through and getting completely skewed picture of reality because the consciousness level of the animal is not the same as the consciousness level of a human being who's projecting him or herself into the animal's experience. Friends, things are never what they seem to you from the outside. Always remember that your projections are purely based on your level of consciousness. So when you look at a person outside you and try to imagine what he or she must be going through, you are doing so from your level of consciousness. And so you can never understand the accurate experience that they are going through because their level of consciousness is different from yours. Maybe higher or it might be lower at that particular moment. You can verify this in your own mind. Do you remember the days of your life as a baby? Say when you were 2 years old or 5 years old or even 10 years old. You have, you may have some dazed remembrance of stuff that happened back then, but you can't recollect most of your days the way you can recollect your days after you were 25 years old or so. Because when you're a child, your consciousness level was totally low. Whereas now, as an adult, your consciousness level is much higher. But in your brain, you can put yourself back into your childhood days and relive some negative experiences from your present level of consciousness and imagine how terrible everything was. Because, in truth, when these things really happened, in actuality, they were a totally different experience. As a child, you were mostly in a daze and went through life almost asleep, through though your body moved around and did whatever was required for its survival back then. Friends, a lot of people just don't get this simple reality of life that your experiences are dictated by your level of consciousness in the now. And it's not possible for you to imagine accurately what your experience would have been like in the past, or to imagine that someone else's experience must be like. You can only know what your experience is like. Right now, everything else is just imagination. When you empathize with someone who you perceive is suffering, you also suffer with that person but your suffering would come from your level of consciousness, which would not be the suffering that that particular person is going through based on their level of consciousness. So you will always have an inaccurate picture of what's going on, and in most cases would torment yourself by projecting a situation in a totally skewed way. Empathy is great, but it puts you in a negative state of being. It's not serving any good to this reality in any way. It just perpetuates the suffering. I'm saying you should always care and put yourself in other people's shoes, but be careful you don't do it too much. The now is always simple. The only way you can experience the now is in your personal experiences with your level of consciousness. So it's always a personal now. And if you just stay with the now without projecting into the past or into the future, you will realize that the now is very simple. It's free of problems, it's easily manageable, and there is nothing overwhelming in it. All the overwhelming or suffering-based thoughts arise when you try to put yourself into the future situation that's not now, or into a past that happened at a lower level of consciousness than what it is now, or into the shoes of another living being whose level of consciousness you can never know. I call all these hypothetical situations, and I never encourage any discussion around the hypothetical situations, because that's not how reality is. Hypothetical situations will always give you a totally skewed picture of what reality really is, like any given moment. Most most doctors have and movie stories are written based on hypothetical situations. When I say doctors, psychiatrists, by trying to imagine what it must be like to be in the shoes of some other being. You can watch movies where animals seem to talk about their problems and start believing that that's how animals are perceiving their reality, when in truth, it's just a human projecting his perceived experiences into an animal. I can state easily that humans, even as children, have the highest consciousness levels compared to any species on the planet, because their brain is much more developed. But of course, there are varying levels of consciousness among humans. Some are at a high level of consciousness, some are at a very low level of consciousness, even as adults. Some humans even die with the same level of consciousness that they had when they were 10 years old, because their brain was not able to grow in awareness, mostly due to physical limitations. I hope this all kind of makes sense to you, because your level of consciousness is not always the same. Remember that your own level of consciousness in the brain is not always at the same level. It keeps dipping or increasing at different times. The highest it can go to would decide your actual depth of awareness, but it's quite possible for your level of consciousness to dip to the level of almost a sleep state, even when you are awake and moving around. Friends, for an example, when you are driving a car, sometimes you can just be lost and not even know how you reached home. There are also people who do some miraculous things and then claim that they have no idea how they did it. That's because in that moment, the consciousness of their brain had switched off and was taken over by the consciousness of their wholeness, which made them accomplish a relatively miraculously feat from their human stances. This happens especially during the cases of emergency. One can later look back and imagine several stories about what really happened, but at the moment their experience was totally dictated by their level of consciousness in their brain at that particular moment. Look, it's finally getting bright out. You can actually see me. Always remember that from a human perspective, your experiences are totally dictated by the level of consciousness in your brain at that given moment. When a person hypnotizes you. He basically just manages to switch off the most of the consciousness in your brain while keeping you in a semi-waking state so that you respond to the commands without any consciousness, conscious interpretation of it. So you don't really remember what you did in the trance because of the conscious part of your brain was switched off or dimmed out. We are aware of the waking state and sleep state of a brain, but there is also a semi-waking state of the brain where it is lost to a consciousness but awake, sometimes like the state you are in while sleepwalking. This is the state of the hypnotist tune into. The bottom line, my friends, of the understanding is to recognize that it's never possible to imagine what someone else is really going through, except through a skewed projection. Inaccurate projections are the cause of close to 90% of our suffering. That's why the simple pointer to just say, to stay in the now instead of making fearful projections about the past, the future, or the living beings outside you. Next time you feel like putting yourself in someone else's shoe, do so while understanding that it's not an accurate projection in any sense. It's an imagination and you're happening from your level of consciousness, a hypothetical situation. It's never exactly the reality what they're going through. Call me at 844-405-HELP to get